The tilted head with a cigarette holder clenched and the radiant smile exuded with optimism at a time when America needed it the most. Though he struggled with his own paralyzed legs, he rescued a crippled nation from the economic chaos of the Great Depression and brought us deftly through the dark days of World War II. After decades of scrutiny, history treats this man well and kindly remembers him by the initials FDR. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, born on January 30th, 1882 in Hyde Park, New York, was the only child of James and Sarah Delano Roosevelt. The genteel comfort of Hyde Park's countryside was home to the Roosevelt family. A retired businessman, James owned a comfortable clapboard farmhouse and employed servants and farmhands to manage the property. He and his young wife Sarah provided a warm and pampered upbringing for their son. James became young Franklin's closest companion and taught him about farming and the social responsibilities of the wealthy. Sarah imparted a sense of organization and attention to detail, although like any youngster, he often disliked it. Like many other well-to-do children of the area, home tutoring provided Franklin's early education. His parents took him on frequent trips to Europe and spent summers on Campobello Island off the coast of Maine, where he learned to love the sea and nature. He devoured anything to do with the Navy and grew up believing that he would be a naval officer. When homeschooling seemed too limiting, the Roosevelts enrolled him in the Groton School for Boys, a college preparatory school located outside of Boston. At the age of 14, he suddenly found himself without the protective affection of his parents. Groton was a strict environment modeled after English boarding schools. Living conditions were simple and very disciplined. By graduation, he had grown to be a dashing six-footer, destined for Harvard University rather than the Naval Academy. At Harvard, he pursued popularity rather than a distinguished academic record. However, his major success was on the school's daily newspaper, the Harvard Crimson. During his freshman year, he became a staff member, eventually working himself up to editor-in-chief in his senior year. As his college days ebbed in 1904, two people had notable influence over Franklin. First, his fifth cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, who was now President of the United States, and second, Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, to whom he became engaged. Better known as Eleanor, she was Teddy Roosevelt's niece and Franklin's fifth cousin once removed. In spite of his mother's disapproval of the marriage, Franklin fell in love with the well-schooled and well-traveled Eleanor. In addition to speaking several languages, she taught working-class people in a New York City settlement house. The nearly 6-foot woman was outwardly awkward and shy and without social prowess, but she opened Franklin's world to the less fortunate. They married on March 17, 1905, while he pursued studies at Columbia University School of Law with the familiar lackluster drive. In 1906, the Roosevelts' first child, Anna, was born. During the next 10 years, 5 more children followed Anna. Despite their political party differences, Franklin was a Democrat, Teddy a Republican. His admiration for his cousin inspired Franklin to explore the political arena. In fact, his path was uncannily similar to Theodore's. Both Roosevelts served as state senator in New York, then as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. The next political step for Teddy was the vice presidency, which Franklin would seek but lose. Both men occupied the governorship of New York, and finally, each was elected President of the United States. In 1910, the not-quite 29-year-old Roosevelt won a seat in the New York State Senate. Once in Albany, Roosevelt determined not to get lost in the crowd. He championed upstate New York farmers and delved into the give and take necessary in politics. As he melded with others in the legislature, his earlier aloofness diminished and he became a hard-working, likable politician. Lewis McHenry Howe became his stunning testimonial in 1912. Franklin, stricken with typhoid fever, could not campaign for re-election. Howe, an Albany newspaperman, became his advocate and articulated his support through newspaper articles. Howe's publicity alone is credited with re-electing the promising Roosevelt, who never made one political campaign appearance. Howe would serve Roosevelt as a close advisor for the rest of his life. In 1913, President Woodrow Wilson appointed Roosevelt Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the youngest to ever serve in the post. Already a Navy enthusiast, he threw himself into the tasks of the job. After World War I broke out, he promoted the need for American preparedness. Franklin believed that a war in any one continent is a direct threat to the peace of all other continents. When the U.S. entered the war, he immersed himself into his job even more. In 1918, President Wilson sent Roosevelt to Europe to inspect American naval stations. In addition, he saw the horror of war firsthand. While on the trip, Franklin caught pneumonia and was sent home to recuperate. While unpacking his suitcase, Eleanor found love letters written to Franklin from Lucy Mercer, Eleanor's 22-year-old social secretary. Franklin declared his love for Lucy. Eleanor said that she would agree to a divorce, or they could provide some semblance of marriage to spare the children anguish. In the end, Roosevelt's strong feeling for his children kept him married, but his marriage was never the same. Marital intimacy was never restored. However, Eleanor assisted Franklin's career immensely, and their relationship became one of respect and even admiration. By August 1920, he resigned his assistant naval secretary post and turned his attention toward the 1920 Democratic National Convention. A 38-year-old Roosevelt was chosen to run for Vice President of the United States with presidential candidate James M. Cox, governor of Ohio. Chosen in part because of the attraction of his last name, Franklin evolved into an eloquent Democratic player, delivering more than 1,000 speeches and traveling 42 states during the campaign. As expected, Cox and Roosevelt lost in a Republican landslide to Warren Harding for president and Calvin Coolidge for vice president. The undaunted Franklin said, "The moment of defeat is the best time to lay plans for future victory." Then suddenly in 1921, while on vacation at Campobello, Roosevelt was severely stricken with polio, an infectious disease that affects the spinal cord. At the age of 39, at the height of his political career, Franklin nearly died. His struggle with polio left him physically challenged, and every day of his life for the next 24 years had to be structured around his disability. He would always be unable to walk without the assistance of leg braces, a cane, and a strong arm to lean on. The experience changed the man. With the encouragement of Eleanor and his close advisor, Lewis Howe, he decided to remain politically active. Franklin functioned as a sort of semi-retired statesman, trying to promote unity between the urban and rural wings of the Democratic Party. The Democratic conventions of 1924 and 1928 became his forum as he nominated Governor Al Smith of New York for president. With assistance, he bravely approached the podium and received a standing ovation. Also in 1924, he began new physical therapy at Warm Springs, Georgia, more out of desperation than real hope. The heavy mineral waters provided a sense of buoyancy that allowed him to swim and exercise for hours without tiring. The workouts developed his arms and upper torso so that he was soon able to stand upright without braces and even could take a few steps by leaning on a cane and holding on to someone's arm. His handicap did much to enhance FDR's liberal sympathy for the underprivileged. He eventually purchased the inn and surrounding land at Warm Springs, creating the nation's #1 nonprofit treatment center for polio victims. By 1928, a number of people suggested that FDR should run for president. But he didn't feel it was a good time to run against the highly respected and very popular Republican presidential nominee, Herbert Hoover. Instead, he ran for and won the governorship of New York. His vigorous campaigning minimized any concerns the voters had regarding his health. 10 months after being sworn in as governor on October 24, 1929, a day known as Black Thursday, the stock market crashed and signaled the beginning of the worst economic depression in American history. In 1930, an overwhelming majority re-elected him to a second term in office. By this time, the pall of the Great Depression was falling over the economy of New York as well as the rest of the country. Increasing gloom gripped a worried nation who had no relief plans. Roosevelt argued that people had no control over their plight. In his opinion, leadership must do anything and everything to improve conditions. As governor, FDR proposed the first direct relief program in the United States. The program used funds to put people to work building parks, roads, and schools. Although he had his opponents, he steadfastly said, "The duty of the state toward the citizens is the duty of the servant to his master." In 1932, economic conditions continued to worsen throughout the nation. Unemployment had doubled to 15 million. 85,000 businesses had failed. 9 million savings accounts had been wiped out. FDR continued to address the seriousness of the situation. On January 23, 1932, shortly before his 50th birthday, Governor Roosevelt announced his candidacy for the Democratic nomination for president. He became the party candidate and faced the incumbent Herbert Hoover on the campaign trail. The campaign seemed to accentuate the differences between the two men. Hoover appeared unreceptive to fresh ideas to stem the nation's economic woes. Roosevelt, in contrast, radiated confidence, giving his party and the nation a sense of hope for the future, though he never laid out concrete solutions. Roosevelt said in his nomination acceptance speech, "I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people." The words struck a strong chord, a new deal, a new start. In the most lopsided victory tallied till that time, Roosevelt won the election. On a misty March 4th, 1933, Franklin Roosevelt approached the inaugural podium with the assistance of his eldest son's arm. And while he would only speak for 20 minutes, Americans lingered on his every word.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Now began what is referred to as the first 100 days. Virtually the next day, FDR and his so-anointed brain trust, a group of academic advisors, went straight to work to fashion the New Deal. 2 days after the inauguration, he ordered all the banks to be closed and audited. 3 out of 4 banks were deemed to be sound and were reopened, thus halting depositor panic. A week later, FDR held the first of his many fireside chats, a radio address to the nation. Never before had a president spoken so directly or informally to the nation. His effective use of radio also allowed him to bypass the newsroom interpretations of his messages. With clear conversational delivery, he subtly engaged people's trust. In addition, the normally obstructive Congress seemed energized by the confident president and quickly enacted 15 major laws that changed the relationship of the government to its people and offered a new political economy that humanely and productively meshed the private and public sectors. Roosevelt's recovery legislation, nicknamed Alphabet Soup, established agencies such as the National Recovery Administration to develop government-business labor cooperation, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration to support farm prices, the Civilian Conservation Corps to employ young men in conservation projects, the Tennessee Valley Authority, a regional public works program designed to assist agricultural needs of water, and the Federal Emergency Relief Administration to administer relief spending. Another flurry of New Deal legislation followed in 1935, which included the Works Progress Administration, which provided jobs not only for laborers, but also for artists, writers, and musicians. The WPA employed an average of 2 million people per month and developed 250,000 projects that included building airports and bridges. Then there was the Social Security Act, which provided help to the states in caring for those over 65. It devised a system of contribution to a fund to to cover unemployment compensation and a program of old age and survivors benefits. To this day, Social Security is an important benefit to retired Americans. In 1936, Roosevelt easily defeated Alf Landon, the governor of Kansas, who had neither the personality nor the organization to keep Roosevelt from his second term as president. Roosevelt had his detractors who disliked so much government interference in business and pointed out that the Depression continued to linger. While unemployment had decreased substantially, 9 million were still without work. FDR focused his eyes on the Supreme Court, which he condemned as an obstacle to his continued progress in restoring America's economic stability. The Supreme Court had declared the National Recovery Administration unconstitutional on the grounds that it gave the president too much power. They also had struck down the Agricultural Adjustment Administration for exceeding Congress's legislative authority. So far, he had no opportunity to appoint his own justices to the court and thereby affect more favorable support. So in 1937, he proposed legislation to add new justices to the Supreme Court. But critics said that he was packing the court and undermining the separation of powers. In spite of his proposal's resounding defeat, the mood of the Supreme Court did become more supportive of Roosevelt's New Deal acts. By the early months of 1939, the economic reforms were relegated to the back burner as America faced a new challenge. Adolf Hitler was rearming Germany. For the better part of his first 2 terms, he was actively against the isolationist view of the world, but to no avail. He had previously asked Congress to repeal the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, and 1937, which prohibited the United States from lending money or selling arms to warring nations, but the response was always no. Then, in early 1939, his appeal to Congress for money to at least bolster national defense was approved. In early September 1939, the president's fireside chat announced the beginning of World War II to his listeners. Hitler was beginning his aggressive march across Europe. Roosevelt asked Congress to pass a new Neutrality Act that would allow the British and French to buy arms and ammunition on a cash-and-carry basis. After much debate, Congress approved the measure. Wendell Willkie ran as the Republican nominee for president in the 1940 election. A relatively powerless candidate, he was easily defeated and enabled Roosevelt to become the only American president to serve an unprecedented third term. But 1940 was a disastrous year for the European allies. Hitler and his Axis forces had overwhelmed their opponents. In June, Paris fell to the Nazis and France surrendered. In August, the Battle of Britain began. In the meantime, the Japanese had joined the Axis bloc. Nevertheless, isolationist feelings in America remained strong. Roosevelt, however, was determined to support Great Britain. America began to manufacture materials for the war ahead when, in May 1940, Roosevelt asked for and received congressional approval to build 50,000 combat planes a year. In July, funds were granted to construct a 2-ocean navy. In January 1941, in his State of the Union address, President Roosevelt laid out his plans for assisting the Allies. Great Britain was out of cash to purchase military equipment under the current arrangement. He now encouraged Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act. Its passage enabled him to send the necessary supplies to any nation whose defense he thought was vital to the security of the United States. He could sell, transfer, exchange, lease, or lend such equipment. By late summer 1941, Roosevelt and the new British Prime Minister Winston Churchill arranged to meet. Churchill hoped to persuade the U.S. to enter the war. Roosevelt wanted to plan for world peace after the war. A significant outcome of the meeting was the Atlantic Charter. The charter stated that neither the United States nor Britain wanted new territory. Together, they promised to help other countries improve their living conditions and to respect the right of people to choose the form of government under which they would live. The friendship of the two men forged during this meeting would have a profound effect on the conduct of World War II. For while they did not always agree, the two leaders shared a dedication to serve their countries and to assure a world free from war. Churchill once said of Roosevelt, "He is the truest friend. He has the farthest vision. He is the greatest man I have ever known." On December 7, 1941, FDR received a telephone call from Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox that at 7:55 a.m. Hawaiian time, Japanese planes had attacked the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack sunk or crippled 6 battleships and 3 destroyers and destroyed 300 planes. Over 2,400 Americans had been killed and another 1,200 had been wounded. In addition, the Japanese had caught General Douglas MacArthur's bombers on the ground in the Philippines, destroying almost every one. American neutrality was over. The Japanese had inflicted military damage, but had politically miscalculated the rage that would inspire the American people to action.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
The United States was now at war. Churchill rushed to Washington, fearing that an angry Roosevelt would hurl all of America's energies into the Pacific to crush the Japanese. To Churchill's relief, FDR concurred that their joint effort should be to beat Hitler first and Japan second. He proudly embraced his new role of commander-in-chief and announced his production goals of planes, tanks, and guns. Without question, he sent the nation into the most productive partnership between government and private enterprise ever experienced. And the wartime economy replaced the concerns of the Great Depression with prosperity. Roosevelt selected a quality military leadership team and gave its members the latitude to run the war, intervening only when necessary. In November 1943, at Tehran, Iran, the first Big Three conference was held. The Big Three included FDR, Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. While the principal goal seemed to be war strategy, Roosevelt moved to create a grand alliance against future war by endorsing the peacekeeping organization that would one day become known as the United Nations. It was agreed that under American General Dwight Eisenhower's command, 1 million men would be led across the English Channel in an assault against the Germans in Normandy, France. On June 6, 1944, the D-Day landings on the Normandy beaches occurred, with the Allies successfully establishing a beachhead in Europe. Meanwhile, FDR's health was declining and the stresses of the job had obviously taken their toll. Despite his reluctance, the Democratic Party drafted Roosevelt to a 4th term. He defeated the youthful Thomas Dewey, the governor of New York. After a brief recuperation in Warm Springs, he returned to Washington in January to tackle what hopefully would be the waning days of the war in Europe. On February 4, 1945, another wartime conference of the Allied leaders was held at the Soviet resort of Yalta. The president's chief objective was to get the Soviet Union to enter the struggle against Japan as quickly as possible. Concessions were made with Stalin that led to the creation of several communist countries in Eastern Europe. The Big Three also reached agreement about the breakup of Germany and planned for German reparations and the creation of an international court to try Nazi war criminals. Finally, in agreement with FDR's passion for a peacekeeping organization, Stalin agreed to join the United Nations, the first meeting which would be held on April 25th. Upon his return to America, a tired and gaunt Roosevelt addressed Congress sitting down.
I hope that you will pardon me for an unusual posture of sitting down during the presentation of what I want to say. I know that you will realize that it makes it a lot easier for me in not having to carry about 10 pounds of steel round on the bottom of my legs, and also because of the fact that I have just completed a 14,000-mile trip
It was the first time that he had ever publicly referred to his paralysis that had crippled him 24 years before. He appeared haggard and far older than his 63 years. Shortly afterwards, he rode the train to Warm Springs, Georgia for a deserved rest, and there on April 12, 1945, he died of a massive cerebral hemorrhage. His death arrived on the eve of complete military victory in Europe and within months of victory over Japan in the Pacific. Late in the morning of April 13, 1945, the funeral train began its slow and respectful journey from Warm Springs through the southern countryside, pausing for a service in Washington. Resuming its journey, the train delivered the president to his birthplace, Hyde Park, New York, 2 days later. And all along the way, crowds of people stood for hours to catch just a glimpse of the train. He had been the beacon of hope, a strong voice of the free world. His jaunty demeanor would fade into a memory, but the strength of his leadership would endure. FDR served as a seeker of reform in the tradition of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Theodore Roosevelt. And he served with good humor that often inspired and could rarely be ignored by even the most hardened political adversary of his day. In 1982, a poll of historians placed Roosevelt second to Abraham Lincoln in the gallery of great presidents. In the year 2000, a new poll once again affirmed his place as second only to Lincoln, as a president whose leadership skills served his country well. A physically challenged man who became a powerful symbol during economic depression and military aggression. A moral compass that pointed the way to relieving the ill conditions of a remarkable era in American history.